And welcome to this meeting of the Scottish Affairs Committee. We're very grateful to our panellists this morning for coming along to give evidence to us, and we're going to be looking at jobs and transition mainly this morning. So could I ask you all to just introduce yourselves and where you're from, please? I'll start with Mr. Cowie.
Hi, and welcome. Glad to be here. So it's nice to see everybody. My name is Neil Cowie. I'm Principal and Chief Executive of North East Scotland College. We're based in Aberdeen and in Fraserburgh and in Peterhead. We operate out 4 campuses there, and I've been in further education for some 26 years, solely in that college, and I have done other things within the region as well, in social housing and in retail. Glad to be here.
Thank you.
Hi, Jim Brown, Energy Skills Partnership. Delighted to be here. Energy Skills Partnership is the college sector agency for everything energy transition, low carbon transport, engineering, advanced manufacture, construction, energy efficiency. We work with all the colleges, industry and government and agencies to really make sure that we can maximise the economic impact through skills development through the colleges. I've also been, until recently, the skills lead for the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council and work very closely with Renewable UK's Investment and Talent Group.
Thank you. Mr. MacInnes.
Good morning. My name is Kenneth MacInnes. I'm the Principal Chief Executive of Forth Valley College. Forth Valley College is centred in central Scotland. We have 3 campuses operating across Falkirk, Stirling and Alba.
That's great. Thanks very much. So I'm going to begin the questioning this morning. The government has said that net zero transition requires rapid reskilling. So in what ways has the further education sector adapted to meet the skills energy challenge? And that was probably best answered, I would imagine, by Mr. Cowie and Mr. MacInnes. So if Mr. Cowie likes to start off. Thank you.
I'm sure Kenny would want to add to what I have to say. I think for the starting point, this isn't rocket science. We're not starting from a fresh base or a low base. A lot of the skills that are going to be required currently, as we make our way through the decline of oil and gas into an energy transition world, are already there. It's kind of fine-tuning what it is that we already offer. Key areas of focus for us are going to be in terms of offshore wind, carbon capture and hydrogen, but the kind of skills that we're seeking to make sure that the future workforce have would include things around energy, general energy transition knowledge, electrical and mechanical engineering, construction, manufacturing, project management, and health and safety and quality. And these are often things that we are already doing, but there might well be add-ons to the offer that we have. And that actually is done very much so in conjunction with employers, who we stay close to and often kind of make sure that what we would be delivering could be tweaked for anything that they feel is going to be required for their workforce.
Yes, I concur completely. I think the skills are already within the sector. A lot of the skills that are required for energy and just transition are traditional skills, starting to work within new fields. The sector is constantly engaging with industry to ensure that we can co-design and co-create qualifications that are relevant. And I think it's an important point to identify that we can get lost with green skills and try to define what green skills actually are. But in terms of carbon capture, in terms of biotech, low carbon energy, a lot of those will require construction skills, mechanical, electrical, fab and weld, very traditional skills. But as we start to engage with new technologies, we have to ensure the curriculum's fit for purpose, and we do that through engagement with industry.
Mr. Brown, did you want to add to that?
Yes, just to kind of reiterate that. I mean, we've shifted away from the term green skills to skills for a green economy. One of the things I think that has been done very well in Scotland is the colleges working together. ESPs have their role in working with the colleges. We have a strategy group really that gives a direction for the ESP and the college network, and we have a number of formal training networks that work together collectively, collaboratively across Scotland in the right geographic areas, doing the right things to develop new curriculum, to deliver new curriculum to best meet employers' needs.
Mr. Cowie, you want to add
Just one additional point, I think, in evidence sessions that have already been given beforehand, Paul Deleu, my colleague from Robert Gordon University, has made it very clear in a report that he created for the National Energy Skills Accelerator, that in essence 90% of the skills that are foreseen for future workforce needs are kind of already in the mix and therefore transferable from oil and gas to energy.
Well, I think you've probably answered my next question, but it might help just to bring the issue out a little bit more if I ask it, which is there enough clarity from both government and the industries about what skills are going to be needed for energy transition?
Maybe start and colleagues jump in. My view is probably not yet.
Yeah.
Looking more long term, I think there's a general lack of clarity relating specifically to maybe what jobs and careers are going to be needed in the more medium and longer term. And I think that will emerge as technologies and industries change. I think also that timescales are a bit tricky in terms of actually making sure that projects and targets continue to progress to the allocated timescales that they've been given, but can consequently slip due to approvals, contract negotiations, and availability of resource. I think also some of the jobs that we know are likely to be required haven't been invented yet, and so that's another thing that we have to consider. But I think what we are aware of, and go back to a point that probably I raised earlier on, we are aware that the skills that are going to be required are exactly the ones that are in play right now for oil and gas industry, the traditional energy industries. So again, thinking about what we do to bridge that in terms of a managed decline of oil and gas towards a kind of energy, green energy economy, then there's more that we can do to consolidate those skills, particularly in younger people. There's also various elements that we'll probably pick up in this conversation around the resourcing and funding of that, and that is obviously a concern for the college sector, because we are increasingly in a position where, through subsequent decline of funding, that we're having to deliver to greater demand for the short, the medium and longer term, with limited amount of resource to deliver that. And I think that's pretty well everything I would want to say there.
I think from me, it's a very complex situation, and we don't have the clarity. We simply don't have the clarity, and there's no way we can have the clarity at this point in time. Industry are working hard. We're working with the Offshore Wind Industry Council. They're doing this skills intelligence model. That will give us some figures coming out towards the end of June. But again, it still won't give that clarity. We don't know who's going to be winning contracts. We don't know what investors we're going to attract. What we do know is that we are competing for the same skills. It's the same skills, and there's different sectors competing for the skills. So we do need more electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, construction, etc. And the volumes of these are quite significant, and we really need to act fast to be able to meet that demand. It takes a number of years to get a qualified individual through the system. So I think it's difficult, but we need to take a bit of a risk, and we need to invest now in order to meet that demand, and so we don't miss the boat.
Yes, I agree with my colleagues. I don't think there is the clarity that is required in terms of the future skills requirements. But I also think, I agree with Neil, that for the college sector, you need future investment to be able to start to change the curriculum. And I think an annualised funding model, which is not finalised until May, when you start delivery in August, and a perpetual cycle makes it difficult. So there has to be a priming for the sector to be able to look at how we start to change or move with the skills needs. I think we're in a fortunate position where there are, as I said earlier, there is the skills are within the sector at the moment, but as that starts to change, there has to be investment, and there has to be an engagement with government to actually set the scene. So obviously with things like within my own area, Project Willow, and also Forth Green Freeport, there has to be an engagement to look at what are the skills that are needed for the size and scale to ensure that the college sector in Scotland can deliver, but can also deliver the timings as well for industry.
So if annualised funding is not helpful in that regard, what sort of period would you be looking to have the funding?
So there's been conversation about a multi-year funding model with 3 years, which would give clarity. I think it would also help industrial relations within the sector as well, which have been problematic over the time. And again, that also creates, I think, for investors and for industry to look at the sector as a mature sector. So I think that would certainly help industrial relations. It would help settle the sector. So I think a multi-year funding model and a block grant type approach would certainly help. It's difficult. I think the Scottish Government's budget is set annually, so yeah, we understand the complexity around about this. But that would certainly help and give the college sector the opportunity to look ahead and start to plan and look at the future workforce that we also need to be able to deliver the skills that are required for industry.
Interesting. Is there a better way of communicating with workers about energy transition and about the training that's going to be needed going forward for them in order to be able to continue a career in energy?
That one. I would agree that we could communicate better. I think it's the college sector can, particularly in cases, be siloed into what we do in terms of the delivery. It's on year, it's what we do, what we know. But I do think with the change in industry and the change in technologies, and I think particularly if you look at what's happening within Grangemouth with Petro-Ineos, there is a requirement that has now. People are seeing that the just transition journey and the challenges and complexities around about it. And I think that we have to, my college has started to engage and being able to support employees that are impacted by the decisions at Petro-Ineos. But we have to communicate, because that's now sent a ripple throughout the workforce in the Grangemouth grouping, and also the communities more broadly, because people are now starting to think, well, that's not a sort of sustainable long-term, that there was something we thought might always be there in terms of the refinery. That's now changed, and I think it has sent a ripple through, so people will now start to look at, well, what's the alternative, what can I do that will give sustainable employment going forward? And I think the college sector is well positioned, but has to be supported to be able to do that.
Yeah. So one of the things that I was concerned about was it's one thing retraining and helping and assisting the existing workers, and that's something that needs to happen. But if you're in a community that has traditionally had a lot of employment from a entity, whatever that entity happens to be, and that looks as though it's not going to be there in the future in that way, are we in danger of losing the skills that we would have developed? Sorry, I'm not explaining this very well, I don't think. But do young people coming through the school education sector need to be given reassurance that there are still going to be jobs needing these skills, even if they're not at Grangemouth Refinery, but they might be somewhere else on the Grangemouth site or somewhere else in the area or in Scotland, I think is what I'm trying to say, really. So, Neil, you look as though you want to come in.
I think that's an interesting one, because I think if you take existing workers and you take the workers that are required who are in school, my college currently has about 6,500 young people in a school college programme right now. And we have done a lot in the energy transition space and continue to do so. We're building a new energy transition skills hub in Alton in partnership with ETZ Limited and with Shell and with other partners, including ECITB. And that's going to be a very valuable tool for us to kind of get people thinking very carefully, younger people, about what future career is going to be needed. There is a challenge, however, and I think it's around government policy. So the key influences for those young people are going to be within school and beyond it. And so consequently, what people are picking up or feeling at home and in school is going to have a sway on how those young people decide to follow an employment path. And I think the uncertainty that there is around various things in terms of how we're currently treating the North Sea and those operating in it is causing a concern, and is actually casting a little bit of a shadow, I think, on the idea that there are going to be opportunities to have full and fruitful careers in energy transition. And I know my colleague from the Aberdeen Grampian Chamber of Commerce, Russell Borthwick, has said to this committee previously that there's also an issue around how young people from universities are thinking about alternatives. Our numbers are good at the college. The demand is high and it remains high for the key areas, the STEM activity that will relate to ordinarily more relatable to energy transition careers. But there is something in there about oil and gas being bad, and we are going to have to manage that decline very carefully. And I think that there's some PR around that, because we still need it to be a sustainable organisation and to ensure energy security. But the good bit of that is it will provide a bridge, if we manage that correctly, where I think a lot of families, particularly in the North East, will benefit from what it is that the energy transition industry has to offer. Just an associated point about people that are already in the industry. I actually was on a phone call last night with my son-in-law, who has worked offshore for many, many years in the North Sea, in Doha, and currently is operating out of Norway. And I just asked him about this, and said, how are you perceiving these things right now, and why have you chosen to operate out of Norway? And his line to me was that, I'm just going to give you this verbatim, for me, work in the North Sea is over. its future is uncertain, and the UK government's delay on policy isn't making things any easier or clearer. On the other hand, Norway is looking after oil and gas industry while it transitions to a renewable energy economy. Workers working here do not have the same degree of worry or concern. In fact, they feel confident that there will be careers there for them a long time to come. So that's just from somebody, one person in the sector I recognise, but he would say that would be representative of many of his colleagues that he's working with.
Interesting. Mr. Brown?
A couple of things for me. A couple of things that have been good practice in the offshore wind sector is obviously you'll be aware of OE UK and our UK work on the skills passporting piece. That will help this, but it's in a very narrow sphere of jobs and job roles. So whether that's expanded or not needs to be considered. But the wind industry has established a forum with the trade unions and industry. I think that's a really good way of getting the messaging out to the current employees. I do think what Neil was touching on, the policy and messaging from government could be clearer and more concise. The drive towards universities and higher education, the number of people we will need at SCQF level 6, 7 will be hugely outweigh the number we'll need at the higher level. There are a number of key graduate programmes we need to really inform and make them aware of the opportunities that there are across the green economy. But colleges have a clear role to play in this, and we need to get this right. So we need to get the policy messaging correct from government. We need to work with industry to get that messaging out to the workforce, but we need to support the colleges to be able to develop that capability, capacity and curriculum and support that transition.
Kenneth?
So, yes, to answer your question, yes, confidence needs to be given. I think we have to give confidence to young people, but also the influencers who are supporting the young people making decisions about what career choices they will make. I think we're fortunate at the moment that many of the skills we've already spoken about are transferable, but there will become a point where we need to probably start to narrow that down because of the way the technology is moving. But I think we have to create that pipeline flow, and it's a push-pull. So you have to have the companies at the other end with the sustainable jobs and employment that will attract, but you then have to have the young people coming into the pipeline. They have to be influenced, and that is through school engagement, it's through college engagement, it's through influencers, parents, guardians, carers, influencing young people towards these career pathways to make the right choices for qualifications that can support the skills needs as we go forward.
Thank you very much. I'll pass to Kirsty Sullivan now.
Thank you. This committee has received evidence, and also not just in written evidence, but people who have come to this committee and also organisations that we've visited, that there isn't yet parity in the remuneration packages in clean energy as to those existing in the high carbon industries. We're hearing about substantial differences in pay, whilst higher than the average salary. They're not really comparable to those in oil and gas at the moment, and the same with pension packages. To what extent are the pay and working conditions in the clean energy sector deterring workers from high carbon industries from transitioning across?
I think it will have an impact. I think it will make the choice of whether somebody with those skills will remain within Scotland or the UK, if they will then look to move abroad to get a comparable salary. And that's been, part of the union's issue related to the refinery decision in Grangemouth about ensuring that employees that exit are moving into comparable jobs. And that's something that Forth Valley College is committed to try to do as best we can through our network of employers, so we can engage with our approximately 350 employers, but that ranges from multinationals down to micro-organisations. So again, and it's not just the technical skills, we have to look at the entire workforce that's impacted, because obviously there'll be a lot of back office and other support roles that will require. So yes, the short answer is yes, it does impact, and it will make decisions, I think, where people will go to get a sustainable salary that's comparable.
Thank you.
And there's anecdotal evidence that's coming out from the sector that those who want to transition into the green industries at this point in time probably have already done so. And these are some of the barriers as the financial packages, etc., terms and conditions that are in the wind industry that are posing that barrier as well. Some of the skills transition issues, there's not a lot of clarity. And there's more coming around what skills are required for people to transition across. But I think the packages are a barrier, but we can better support the industry through some of the skills provision and supporting that transition through as well. So I think the passport piece is quite important, so that people aren't having to totally retrain, but having to top up on the skills that they need rather than the full package. Yeah.
If for what I know, and I'm not an expert on this, so forgive me, but I think that there is some evidence being suggested through, I think, SDS's reporting of it, that some of the careers may well offer a generous salary in terms of comparable to oil and gas salaries. That said, I think that there's a recognition with the North East generally that pay within energy transition careers is probably not going to be able to compete with those of oil and gas. And I think that where I'm more interested in is what impact does that then have on getting those talented people that are in that industry right now upskilled and reskilled, because it's kind of disincentive to go and do that if in actually you're thinking then you're not going to get paid as well as you have previously.
I mean, it's important to say it's not poorly paid roles, they're still well paid roles, but just on the level that you get in the oil and gas sector.
It's making that direct comparison. Yeah. Thank you. And just to continue with that theme, we have also met some workers from oil and gas who want to make the transition but have had to foot the training bill themselves. So how prevalent is it that workers are having to pay the bill for their own retraining, and how do you think that could be addressed and shift the onus away from the individual?
That's a really good point, because there have been initiatives in the past that have supported individuals to transition across. We had the National Transition Training Fund, we had the Flexible Workforce Development Fund, but they've all ceased to exist. So at the moment it's a real struggle to support individuals. We are working with the Scottish Government on a £3 million pot of funding to support the wind industry, and there's an element of that within that ask and offer to industry. But there's a real challenge there. We need a strategic plan on this, and we need to support these workers, and we need to have interventions that will support that transition across. Most of the skills are there, it's just these top-up pieces, so it's micro-credentials, it's the GWO, Global Wind Organisation, basic safety standards, basic technical training standards that people are required to meet. But then they still have to go on and do the turbine manufacturer's training as well, but that tends to be done once they're in employment. So I suppose that if there's anything that can be done is to set up a Flexible Workforce Development Fund, National Transition Training Fund that could support these individuals. And I don't think that all necessarily needs to come from the public purse. I think in the work I've done with the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, we've looked at establishing a co-investment fund and see how we can use the community benefit funds and some of the other funds that the developers have at this stage to invest in these and support the transition piece.
For me, I think it's a bit of a yes and no. That one that we do have evidence that there are employees who are paying for their own upskilling and reskilling, but we're also involved in initiatives where that is not the case, and actually it's supporting those people already in employment to actually manage that energy transition. So, for example, we work with Shell UK, and we've provided opportunities for fee waivers for those upskilling and reskilling in key disciplines. And we've also been able to, and that's particularly relevant around, for example, electric vehicle infrastructure, where we understand the demand is pretty high, but the training is free. So that's what we've been doing there. We're also a partner within the National Energy Skills Accelerator, which is a kind of collaboration between ourselves, University of Aberdeen, and Robert Gordon's University, and we managed to secure about £1 million of just transition funding for fee waiver courses there. And that provided something in the region of over 700 fee waiver places, which fundamentally helped to remove barriers for those seeking to upskill into energy transition type careers. We've also been able to develop new courses as a consequence of that, and then offer them free too, in what it is that we are doing. However, where I think, and I would echo what Jim has said, the Flexible Workforce Development Fund is a key point for us north of the border. Our college was operating anywhere between 1.1 and 1.9 million pounds of a training fund, which was very much valued by those people who were receiving it, and it allowed us to engage with employers in the North East very successfully. Employers that ordinarily we wouldn't have been engaging with, and overnight that disappeared off our budget line and of the Scottish Government's. And consequently, we've never really got back into that space. And I think there is again a debate to be had about how best we use apprenticeship levy, because again there are some challenges that fit north and south of the border for us, and it is an interesting issue, and we might well get into that in a little bit more detail as the conversation progresses. Thank you.
Just because you've raised that, Neil, I wonder if you could just expand on that just now. I have heard from other industries that there is an issue with how the apprenticeship levy is operating in Scotland, and I'd be really keen for this committee to get a better understanding of what that is and how it directly impacts on the energy sector.
Okay, so that may be, and I might just broaden that out a little bit to talk about funding more generally, because I think that has a kind of a relevance to the conversation that we have. But as I said, for our college, and Kenny wouldn't be probably too dissimilar in terms of what the allocation would have been, we kind of saw a very valuable pot of money disappear, and it allowed us to engage. And that money is in essence driven through the apprenticeship levy. I know that there's work north of the border right now that's seeking to look at how that could be best used. But if you look down south, I think there's greater employer engagement in the apprenticeship levy, and of course then you look at how certain things are funded, and that kind of leads me into a conversation around modern apprentices. Now we have about 1,000 modern apprentices on our books. We're the biggest modern apprentice provider in the north east of Scotland, and we're glad to be so, but our demand is ever increasing. But the MA funding isn't comparable either between north and south. So we are probably talking about £10,000 of funding generally that we would receive from SDS, with another 10,000 on top of that we would top up through the credits delivery that we have in terms of our targeted allocation from the Funding Council. That still leaves us short by about £7,000 in comparison to an engineering apprentice, for example, south of the border. And again, I think there's something that we need to explore about that inequity. There's other things I think that we just need to consider also. It's well documented that the colleges sector in Scotland has been hit with 17% real terms cuts over recent years, and there's numerous Audit Scotland reports that saying that actually, as key delivery agents of the skills agenda in Scotland, they're underfunded and need supported. So I think there needs to be a little bit of a rethink about how that is done. There are various review reports that have been actually identified, including Withers. And I think, and I'm grateful for the Scottish Government's response to that. And that has kind of allowed us to think more carefully, I think, or rather the SFC and Scottish Government to think more carefully about how they should be funding colleges going forward. And I welcome what has been put on the table in terms of the signposting of a reformed funding model. But in my mind, I think it's too little and it's too late and it's a little bit too slow. And because we're seeing demand starting to crank up, we really want to get cracking now with this. We want to be able to deliver to what our regional partners are seeking. And I think that, and what I'd also say is that the model isn't fair. And, if I use my college as a case in point, we are a college that came together. We are the Regions College for the North East, and we came together through two legacy colleges, one very city-based and one rural-based. And there was a rurality premium within the legacy college in the rural areas of Fraserburgh and Peterhead that allowed us to sustain an offer that was comparable to those of our Aberdeen counterparts. But that basically got stripped away. So for basically around about the last 12 years, we have been disadvantaged to the tune of about £3 million per annum. And actually, we have been, I think, pretty effective to try and make sure, even though we're still running a deficit budget, it is manageable. But the reality is that we know that demand is on the increase. We are a higher performing college. We're making inroads into the things that our region's economy is going to need. But I am asking more and more of people within my college, whether they're in Aberdeen Alton's campus, Aberdeen City campus, the Peterhead Maritime Academy or our Fraserburgh campus, to do far, far more with less of them. And I don't think that model is sustainable, because in reality, we want to crack on and deliver what it is in terms of a managed oil and gas transition to energy transition going forward. And I think that there are some fundamental questions that we need to ask about how colleges are funded in Scotland to ensure that we deliver to the ambitions of the National Strategy for Economic Transformation and actually for our employers.
So in short, colleges aren't in the place that they could be or should be in order to fully play their role in the skills transition. We could be further ahead had colleges been better financially supported.
There was an interesting, sorry to cut across you, Kirsty, but there's an interesting statistic. We were, I think, 1 year as NESCO, 1 year down the road as NESCO, and my predecessor, Rob Wallen, instigated a report done by a company called MacInnes. And it was quite interesting that for the £32 million of public investment that went into NESCO at that time, and that's gone to about 35 million now, there was about £440 million of return to the regional economy. So it tells you that the money that's invested in the college sector is well invested. You get good value for the public purse. But the reality is that we are still offering a very broad offer to our. I talk about it back at home about we've got wide doors and deep reach. We are an anchor institution. We have responsibilities to many, many learners, whether they're in employment or not. And without that broad offer, there are many, many people who will simply not be able to progress onto anything meaningful in the way of further education, higher education or employment. To sustain that and to actually deliver to, rightfully so, the demands of our regional partners and actually some of our local and global partners too, needs more funding. And we simply can't keep on cutting what is already a very lean entity any further back.
Thank you. Sorry, before you go on to your next question, Kirsten, I think Susan Murray had a supplementary.
So it's just a very brief one. And so I met a young man in my community in Mid-Dumbartonshire the other day who is a North Sea diver who is training to move into the offshore wind sector. And he was having to pay for it himself. Obviously, Mid-Dumbartonshire is on the west of Scotland. Is there more accessibility to retraining, funded retraining on the east side of Scotland rather than the west?
I wouldn't say necessarily. I mean, flexible workforce development fund's been cut, it's gone. I'm not saying necessarily that might have covered that type of specific training, but I agree with the point that was made. There needs to be a strategic fund set for transition to allow skilled workers to cross-skill, upskill into different areas. So no, I wouldn't say unless there was a specific pot of funding, you're not necessarily seeing that the East Coast is any significantly different from the West Coast. I would say that it's inconsistent. I think that there are decisions taken. I wouldn't say there's a consistent strategy, and I would say that there are decisions taken depending on the political challenge. So for Petroleum, for example, there's been money made available for there, but that's not consistent with other businesses that then find themselves exiting employees, and they may have to cover the costs themselves. So we are in receipt of funding to support employees exiting Petroleum to be retrained. And we are supporting through a training needs analysis and a retraining programme at the moment. But again, it's a finite pot of money.
Maybe just add to that, Susan. I think that, again, I couldn't necessarily comment about how things are in the West. I'm not particularly focused or referenced on that. But I think that one of the things that's probably benefited the East is the alignment of regional economic partnership working. So again, thinking about the National Energy Skills Accelerator and how we've managed to offer fee waiver, successfully offer fee waiver to many people that are seeking to upskill or reskill. That's on the back of a lot of work that's been happening a long time between partners who know each other really, really well. So consequently, I think that when we were looking at bidding in to get the Just Transition Fund for that, we were already pretty well aligned about how we could do and what we could offer. So I think the advantage to those people in the North East, for example, probably came from those relationships that have been going on for a long, long time, and very much focused in on making sure that energy transition, which is the kind of regional economic priority for the North East, was actually as successful as it could be.
Yes, so just...
Could I just make a brief point on the funding? So just to reiterate, we are facing a significant deficit for next year's Forth Valley College, and the decisions that we may have to make as an organisation are significant. And it's been touched upon that colleges are anchor institutions that sit across the communities. We are the point of access for people who come into education with no entry requirements and can exit with degrees, and we transition that the way through. Our school partnership is significant. Forth Valley College has over 1,100 MAs, so we've got one of the biggest SDS contracts in Scotland. But the way the funding is allocated, the SDS funding has not increased in nearly 10 years per head of MA. We also then use our credit funding, but that's a finite pot. So if I have more MAs that come through employer choice to my college, I then need to make a decision, what else do I stop doing? So that finite pot that we get for our credit allocation, we can bring the SDS funding in if it's available, because that is still capped as well. So I think it's important to understand that there are restrictions within the funding model. The fact it's actually underfunded is one element, but the way that it's then constructed is another element, and that puts real bureaucracy and challenge. We have capacity across our campuses to do more, but there are MA caps within Scotland, and I think also the levy is paid down to the UK government and returned to the Scottish Government, and then the decisions get made are based at obviously a devolved level. So there are challenges within the sector. We have one of the biggest public investments, up to about 240 billion coming into Scotland in terms of public sector investment, in terms of infrastructure. And I think that the college sector is at the heart of being able to deliver the skills going forward, but we have to have that engagement and investment so that the colleges are primed and ready to go. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to move on to my last question for now. This committee has also heard from many people that relocating for clean energy jobs is another barrier. How much of a problem is this?
I'll come in on this if you don't mind. I mean, I think there's major challenges on this, particularly due to the nature of where a lot of these activities are. If we look at the Cromarty Firth, the whole housing infrastructure, the whole support infrastructure for attracting new people in and housing people is a real challenge. There's not enough people in the regions where they need them to be. So there's going to be major challenge in attracting people into these areas. How do we make that attractive? Don't know. But I think we need to support the indigenous companies. We're going to be attracting inward investors into these areas. Skills is a key decision factor for any inward investor. We've been working with SDI and Scottish Enterprise around some of this, and the skills is their second decision factor, whether they locate. And it's colleges that will be delivering that level of skills. So I think we can only do our best to make sure that we can communicate what the job opportunities are, create the workforce as best we can, and support the industries as best we can. But again, it goes back to we need the policy drivers for this. We need the funding to take it forward. We need targeted funding to support this. One of the things that's been touched on is the modern apprenticeships. The Engineering Skills Leadership Group has said that the demand for apprentices is 20% more than we're actually funded this year because of the cap on apprenticeship places. So that's a gap, that's an opportunity we're missing. So what do? Do we put the cap or the resources towards the engineering, construction type apprenticeships and move that away from something else, or do we invest more in apprenticeships? I think that's one of the key things that we've not touched on. And we need to look at the whole new entrant piece as well as the transition piece. Most of the discussion has been about that transition piece. We need to support new entrants in this. We need a campaign to really present the opportunities across the whole green skills agenda, because there's a huge amount of opportunities there and there's very minimal awareness amongst the school population and influencers.
Thanks, Jim. That's an important point you make about demand, because we heard the same from the higher education sector related to space and engineering. So really interesting, and it comes back to those tough choices. The demand's there, but the funding isn't currently supporting what you can offer. Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, we were talking about barriers in connection with relocating on this question, so it'd be helpful to stick to that.
So barriers on communicating?
Relocating.
So, yeah, I was going to make the point about significant infrastructure coming through, stored hydropower, Cruachan 2, Corrie Glass, and one of the conversations there about is having communities put in place to be able to support housing that would support a workforce. in very rural locations, and the amount of infrastructure that has to be put in place, access roads, housing, possibly even creating small new villages to be able to support a workforce that would then have a social sustainability going forward for the communities. So there is and that's about in having sustainable, proper housing that would attract people to want to come and work and live, and then have sustainable jobs within these areas. So you'll have the boom for construction, which will then downsize to an operation. And I think it's important that, again, we have that policy driver to ensure that when we have these massive infrastructure investment projects, that we have the support and infrastructure and about it to make it attractive to bring in a skilled workforce and be able to maintain that skilled workforce as we go forward.
Thank you.
Kirsten, just to add to that, I think that there was an SDS Green Jobs in Scotland report that suggested that the concentration of jobs for an energy transition would be probably located in eastern Scotland or southwest Scotland. So for us in the northeast, we're kind of making sure that we're trying to be as open about attracting people into the region, but also we've got a very strong focus on retaining the talent within the region, and I think that's just the key thing for us. It has, and we've got various projects that we've been involved in. We've, for example, the Moray East operation that's operated by Ocean Winds out of the Fraserburgh Harbour, for example, that has those people that have been skilled and retrained have been developed through NESCO, our college, and that's been done through our Fraserburgh and Altons campuses. And also, whatever happens in terms of the ACOM project, our Shell engineering scheme, which has been running for many, many years, would allow locally trained technicians to go back into St Fergus and do, in essence, more or less the same job, but kind of the other way around. So there is something very much there that is about making sure that we retain the talent as best we can for the North East.
Thank you.
Moving on to Susan Murray's question.
Thank you very much, Chair. So we've heard quite a lot about the challenges the colleges are facing and some of the solutions that you're putting in. But what do you think that the UK government should be doing to support the provision of energy transition skills? What more should they be contributing?
I definitely think there needs to be a strategic skills fund. I think there needs to be engagement with the Scottish Government. I think there needs to be a conjoined engagement to drive us forward for the UK and from the UK Government to engage and to ensure, I think, through conversations, through funds that are released, that they are targeted to where they're needed when they come up to Scotland. So I think that would definitely be a help to make sure that the strategic funds are set up and then delivered so that they can make the most impact.
I know there's plans for a green workforce strategy, and I think getting that right in the first instance would be a real boon for this. I think to support that then is the kind of strategic funding that would drive this, and that we need to get that across the border, and we need to have it ring fenced for the activity that supports the sector. The colleges need to have line of sight and confidence, as do industry, about these opportunities, the timelines. So understanding the demand piece would be really key if we can get a good understanding of that across the different areas. We tend to focus more on kind of oil and gas to wind transition, but there is the low carbon transport and the whole infrastructure that supports that. We've got the grid that needs to be upgraded to support that, and it's all the same skills. So we can't look at things in isolation. So some key messaging, strategic messaging, consistency of messaging coming through, and that strategic pot of funding. I think a campaign to promote the jobs in the sector as well, and I'm going to kind of take a shift here, because most of the talk is about construction, engineering, etc., but we need a whole workforce, and the critical skills at this point in time are in the developer space. So it's environmental, it's higher level skills. So the universities have got a key role to play at this stage, but the colleges are just kicking in, the numbers are kicking in now. So we need that lead time, and we need to invest now to get the capability of class in the colleges, the CPD, the curriculum, and start the messaging now to the existing employees in the sector, but also the future talent.
Susan, for me, I think it is about clarity of position on what is it considered in the North East as a very sort of prohibitive taxation system for those operating within the North Sea. I think that if you're looking at this in the medium to longer term, that is stalling future investment in the energy transition. So there needs to, for me, and actually for a good other set of people that I operate and work with as colleagues in the North East, I think some clarity about what that's likely to be, and also around licensing. And we've already had, for example, Harbour Energy this week lose another 250 jobs. I know that the Chamber are behind this because there's genuine concerns. I think that's on top of the 350 they've lost earlier this year. And they are taking their business, or looking to take their business, to Brazil and Canada. And that is not good for the North East, it's not good for Scotland, it's not good for the UK. So I think there needs to be a degree of clarity about what we're going to do next there. Because without that sort of investment, I don't see us getting to where we need to with an energy transition. We're going to need to have a managed decline of oil and gas to get us to that second bit. I don't feel and I think I'm not alone in saying this, we don't necessarily feel it's managed. That said, I think there's other things that we need to consider, and it's obviously how the UK government funds the Scottish government. And I think that there is something about a better understanding about, well, what are the skills priorities going to be for Scotland? And how can we make sure that that is funded correctly to a level that doesn't allow Kenny and I and Jim to have to complain routinely about the fact that we're being asked to do more, when there is clear economic benefit by making sure that this transition happens. And actually, from our perspective as civic anchors, the benefits that there could be for inclusive economic growth, this could reach people that on the margins of communities that simply would not be reached. And I think there needs to be a fundamental conversation about what the Barnett Consequentials actually offers up to Scotland in terms of that allocation to the college sector. I think also that there's some clarity required around GB Energy. We're grateful that they're locating in Aberdeen, and I think when we've turned up for meetings previously with the Jurgen Mayor, I've been to one where he introduced himself to the Regional Economic Partnership and other people very much within the oil, gas and future energy sectors. We were encouraged by what was being said, but again, just making sure that we are very much aligned to the ambitions of what the UK government have for GB Energy, and how then we play into that for the common good. And I think probably I think that pretty well covers everything I wanted to say. We are grateful very much so about the collaboration that's already ongoing between UK government and Scottish government. And we've been a beneficiary of the Just Transition Fund, which has been very helpful to kick off some of the projects that we wanted to have in and around Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire, which has afforded us an opportunity to start thinking, right, okay, what is it that energy transition looks like for us and for Scotland and for the UK more broadly. Thank you.
So, we clearly need to transition the energy skilled workforce across. But it's interesting to what you were saying earlier, Jim, about the wider skills base that's absolutely going to be necessary, because referring back to Kirstein's question, if there's no accommodation for people, it's very difficult for people to relocate. But in terms of things that have been put in place to try and help, have you seen any evidence that? And I think probably I'm going to direct this back to Neil again. Any evidence that the energy skills passport is working as it was intended, and combine that with how the government's skills pilot in Aberdeen, which you have mentioned, has impacted what you're able to offer and deliver for potential students.
I think there's a recognition, again, thinking about evidence that's given to this committee already. I think that we know that the skills passport is something that is a work in transition. So I still think that we're not quite there yet. And I know that there are some further works to do on that. I think in terms of piloting, I think that certainly in terms of energy skills initiatives, they are beginning to bear fruit. And I think that what we have become as a college, and actually as a broader college sector, we've become very, very useful at being sort of adaptive and agile when these things have come to pass. We recognise that if that's what we, whether it's our membership organisations or whether it's our membership organisations of industry or it's our industrial partners and employers, if that's indeed what they think is the best thing to do, then they often would come to us to say, can you do it? And we would seek to do that. And I think there's many a scheme that Jim and Kenny and I and our other colleagues more broadly would have been involved in, just in terms of listening to employers and making sure that we were responding to their needs as quickly as possible. That said, there is still some work to be done on these things. I think that we just need to make sure that we keep the momentum going.
Thank you. So, I think ask all three of you how confident you are that the Office for Clean Energy jobs will have a positive impact on the workforce and workforce planning in Scotland.
I certainly think yes, I do, very much so. And I think that fundamentally it is the right thing to be doing. And for all sorts of reasons that we've talked in earlier about the managed decline of the oil and gas sector, we would not want to be importing more oil and gas. But at the same time, the skills that we know that are in that industry that are very much needed for energy transition need to be retained. And that's the thing that I think is really at the crux of this. And to be able to do that will actually send not only a really positive message to those who are already in the industry and wanting to kind of use their skills, their talents, and maybe with some tweaking around the edges in terms of just upskilling or reskilling towards more energy-related careers. But it sends the right kind of message to those people that are coming behind them. As I said earlier, we're working with about 6,500 young people on a school college programme. And there's a significant chunk of opportunity through the various other things that are very specifically related to energy transition that is showing increased engagement around what it is that we are doing and where they could go as young people into adults and into an energy transition career. I think that would be strengthened, Susan, if the messaging around the security of oil and gas and that managed decline was stronger, and that we were able to work with those people operating in and around the North East and more broadly and globally than that to ensure that the North East did play its part in managing that energy transition with the skills that we've already got in it.
Yeah. I think, yes, I mean, we need to really address this. I think Chris Stark said last week that 2025 is a critical year for the energy transition piece. I would say the same from a skills perspective. We need to develop a toolkit that can support a whole range of individuals and organisations through this, and this is where I think the government's got a real role to play in giving that strategic direction, timelines, commitments, and again we'll go back to looking at the funding model. I would say the work that's going on in Scotland through the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council is really quite good. It's taking much longer than it should. So it's looking at a skills charter, it's looking at the demand side, it's looking at the sector recruitment attractiveness, it's looking at upskilling, retention, it's looking at, so there's 6 priority areas that are being taken forward, and there's a short life work group working on that with great ambitions, but it's still not happening quick enough. So I think the urgency is the big thing for me in how we progress things.
Thank you very much. Before we move on to the next question, can I just ask both members and witnesses to be as succinct as possible? We're not making a lot of progress, I'm afraid, in getting through the agenda this morning. And having said that, I'll call Stephen Flynn. No implications there, Stephen.
I'll be as succinct as I possibly can be. If you're a former employee of Beam in West Hill or Belmar Engineering in Altons, if you're one of the harbour employees, the 250 that are about to lose their jobs, or one perhaps of the 350 that lost their jobs a couple of years ago, if you work as a former employee of the refinery at Grangemouth, are you looking at the job market right now and saying, you know what, there's clean energy jobs there that will allow me to transition today, tomorrow, or in the coming weeks?
I think it's the job market can flex. I think there will be some clean energy jobs, but again there will be probably the opportunity to move into other sectors where those skill sets may be transferable, and that's something that we've been doing within the Central Belt, is to look across our employer network. Again, it's trying to find those comparable jobs that will pay a comparable pay, but the skill sets can be transferable, and that's where engaging with our employee network to understand the cross-skilling that's required so that we can work. So yes, I think it'll be a bit of a miss. I can't say everybody will just step out and straight into clean energy jobs. It will be a mix, and people will probably move into might move into maritime, might move into manufacturing, production, but those skill sets will be transferable. But again, it goes back to the point that was made earlier, some people having to pick up the cost put those skills in place to be able to get the right skill set to be able to transfer.
So if we broaden it out then, there's tens of thousands of people that are employed in the high carbon industries in Scotland, in the oil and gas sector in particular, particularly in the north east of Scotland. And I think Neil made reference to Paul Dilley's report earlier, where Paul talks about the Goldilocks zone, where you effectively have the oil and gas industry operating, and you have the clean energy sector building up, and those jobs can transfer. We're not at that point, are we? When we're nowhere near it right now, are we? That's the reality of the situation.
We're not at that point. But there are opportunities there, and I would say the offshore wind industry is not good at communicating the job roles. There's no place you can go to find out what jobs there are. Most of it's done through LinkedIn. So the industries really need to come together around this. I think there is a bit of work going on that.
So is there a wider danger then that if we see what we are seeing at the moment with job losses in the traditional industry, that we will see effectively could see flight of those skills and expertise abroad? It's a transient workforce after all, and does that put an even greater emphasis on the need for investment in net zero, but also the protection of what we have now to allow you to get back to that Goldilocks zone, as opposed to where we are now, which is, I think you've all just agreed, we're not there yet.
I think there's an element of timing involved. So the jobs are going, and we're not there with low carbon biotech jobs. They are coming. There's a future, but again, there's only some projects that have broken ground. Look at Celtic Renewables, for example, and what they're doing, and they're looking to grow and expand. RWE are looking at coming in. There's hydrogen. There's a host of things that could be potentially happening through Project Willow. But again, it's timing, and again, those skills could go. So there's a gap. We've got a gap. The jobs are being lost at the moment, but we've got this huge infrastructure, Fourth Green Freeport, massive opportunities. But how do we bridge that gap so we don't lose the workforce? And that's the dichotomy we're in at the moment. Yeah,
and I guess in that context, particularly on the back of your Project Willow reference there, although it's relevant to the wider North East itself, it's vital that we see projects like the ACOM project taken forward because of the multidisciplinary aspects that sit within that, the ability for people to, as Neil said earlier, go from effectively doing the job that they're doing to doing the job in reverse going forward. So seeing projects like ACOM come forward is hugely important, I would suggest. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, totally agree that these projects are so important. But again, it's down to timing. It's the timing of this. And the fact, in the case of the point I come back to, is that with the current underfunding that's coming into the sector, the college sector is having to deliver balanced budgets and make decisions, and then you can't cut to grow.
So just finally then, so we're talking a lot about people transitioning from oil and gas sector into the renewable sector, and making sure that we have the skills passports in place, making sure that these individuals have the support that's required. Do you sense an appetite amongst people in that industry to do that, given that we appear to have accepted that the jobs don't exist right now? Is there that appetite for them to want to go and put themselves through that training, knowing that there's not a job there?
Well, what we're seeing through our engagement with Petro Ineos, and we're working with, obviously, PACE, we're working with SDS, Falkirk Council. We've engaged with 456 employees. 381 have come forward, and 77 have said they've secured further employment. So we're currently working with 304. We're seeing training in NEBOSH, BOSET, project management, first aid training. So a number of training suites that are coming forward. But people are sort of, I think at this moment, grasping, because they see their employment coming to an end and they're looking where can I go. So some will go abroad, some will go offshore, and we will try and transition other people into comparable paid jobs. But again, but we need the jobs to be there, or we're transitioning people out. People are exiting out the system. People are moving into completely different other spheres, going in, setting up private businesses and saying, you know what, this is too problematic now. It's too much of a risk to work in this industry. Therefore, I'm coming out, and you lose that skill set. So it is this timing.
You want to jump in, sir?
I would agree with Kenny. I think to the general point you're trying to make, Stephen, for me, I think it is fundamentally about making sure that we do not lose talent, and actually that there are jobs to transition into, and again thinking about the impact that could have, on those people that are coming behind, the younger people. It sends the wrong kind of message that if we're losing people from the oil and gas sector right now, because there's a lack of clarity around investment, there's a lack of clarity about licensing, there's a prohibitive taxation system that's kind of impacting significantly on those people operating within the North Sea, then if you were in that sector as your paid employment, would you be encouraged to kind of go back to it? Anecdotally, we've got plenty of information that would suggest that people are drifting from the oil and gas sector into other jobs like bus driving. That's, with all due respect, I'm sure they'll be excellent bus drivers, but the skills that they're going to take with them is a loss to the potential for an energy transition economy. And we know that there are people, and I cited my son-in-law earlier on, for example, working in different fields in other parts of the world. Again, that doesn't necessarily help us.
Yeah, and I think we're all in Aberdeen very familiar with people who've moved to work elsewhere, and the consequence of that for us domestically. Just finally, if I may, Jim, before you come in that context then, Neil, because you did mention young people, and we are talking a lot about people transitioning, and a lot of these people are already in good jobs. So for the young people themselves, do we see that burning appetite there for them to get on and embrace the net zero opportunities that exist? Or are they looking at that going, I really want to do this, but ultimately I don't see the job. Cruachan, which you mentioned earlier, Drax announced last week, I think it was, that they're not going to be taking it forward at this point because of cap and floor mechanisms in place. We've had uncertainty on Acorn for well over a decade. A lot of the supply chain that's wanting to move into the offshore wind sector, they just don't have the order book right now. So some of them, which had earmarked 10-15% of their business to be renewables, have now scaled that all back into oil and gas because they just simply don't have that clarity of vision. So the young people themselves, do they see that in the same way, where they want to do this, but the job security and certainty isn't there, so they're pivoting to something else, which has a consequence in terms of what policy?
That's a question that we've already had. I think I asked that question earlier on this morning, so if you want to add to the answer you gave earlier, fine, but otherwise we can move on.
I can add something to that. I think the point's well made. I think there is appetite from young people where they are already engaged with the idea of what energy transition might mean and what it might mean in the way of future employment. Our college, as you already know, Stephen, is heavily involved in a lot of initiatives at school level, which will see people kind of transition successfully into a career, whether they're girls in energy or whether the S2 STEM competition that has thousands of young people engaged in what it is that we do to encourage them to think about those future careers. But we're one college, and we rely on a lot of influences, within and beyond us to make sure that the messaging is right for those young people. My concern is that when you get these kind of messages, as we have had in Aberdeen this week, it sends the wrong kind of message about, that managed decline, energy, oil and gas, then helping us to transition to a more greener economy.
Generally, there's a huge lack of awareness. That's why we're saying we need to do this whole campaign about the sector recruitment attractiveness, influencing the influencers, etc. On the timing piece, I think you're absolutely right. It's critical, and one of the really positives that's coming out of the skills intelligence model that's going to be published in June by Offshore Wind Industry Council, RUK, is that they've aligned that with the Energy Pulse. Well, the Energy Pulse is their system where they put in every project, and they adjust the timelines depending on the feedback from the developers, and that's onshore wind as well as offshore wind as well as large scale solar. So they will churn out the numbers that they need in the different roles depending on that timeline. The problem is the timelines keep slipping, so it's only accurate at that point in time, and we know there will still be further slippage because the grid connections are critical, and it's just not going to be there, which is another challenge in itself.
Indeed. I'll get another half an hour on that.
Yeah, once we manage to get through everything else we've got to do. Pass over to Maureen Burke now. Thank you, Maureen.
The UK has an ageing workforce of 1 in 3 workers over 50. To make it a success for net zero, surely we need to encourage more people to stay and transition into the clean energy sector. Can you comment on what you see as the biggest skill gaps? I know we spoke a lot about that today, but what are the biggest skill gaps in the UK energy sector? Whether it be overseas workers, do we need to address that if that's the case? The shortages could be filled by encouraging young people in the sector, but I think we've spoke about how difficult that is for young people now with the cuts to the colleges and also having to pay for their own training. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
There are 16 critical roles that have been identified by Renewable UK, and most of them are in that development space. A lot of them are in the engineering base, wind turbine operation maintenance, fabrication welders, there's a huge gap in that space. Overhead linesmen, grid infrastructure, control room operators, digital skills. There's a whole swathe of skills, but a lot of these skills, as we've touched on already, are already here, and a lot of them are easily transitioned across to other roles. It's just how do we provide a mechanism to facilitate that? We need more fabrication welders, we need more wind turbine techs, we need more electrical engineers, we need more control instrumentation. No, we need more to come through the pipeline and new entrants, as well as supporting those who are already in the workforce. But if you're a senior authorised person in the electrical power generation space, you can ask for whatever salary you want, because there's just not enough of them. And how do we actually generate them? You can't do that overnight. So this is why we need to plan ahead and look at as well as supporting the existing workforce, look at that future talent pipeline as well, and we need to act.
I would say keeping pace with digital skills, especially with an ageing workforce, and ensuring that we remove the barriers and the complexity. They may see that, perceive that's there that might not be there, but certainly with AI coming forward and the pace of change. So I think digital skills is a key blockage, and we need to make sure that with those that have still got a number of years to work within the industry, how do we support those transitions with digital skills? Because that's probably the rest of the part of traditional skills very much got a core element to it. It's that support and periphery and the change of pace around about digital skills is a key area.
And I wouldn't argue with anything that Kenny or Jim have said. For brevity, what I would also say is that we've seen a significant ramping up in our civils activity. Yeah. So infrastructure work, construction, and the likes is proving a bigger demand on us, and we're adapting our curricular offer accordingly. So I think that's something to consider in there. And it would be remiss of me not to mention seafarers, because we obviously have the Scottish Maritime Academy in Peterhead, but we're going to need them too.
It is a concern for me about the barriers that are there for young people, and you spoke about that, is how do we get that message out to the schools and the colleges. So is there anything we can do that can help you in that? Is there a plan to get into the colleges? Because I know there's a lot of schools in my area that would be very interested in taking maybe even some of these young people into the colleges and letting them see what's there, because we've done a number of visits to the colleges ourselves and you can see the innovation there. So I'm just wondering if that's something.
I think I think there's a bureaucracy around about the funding model where the amount of funding we can put towards engagement within schools is capped. And certainly there's a move now away from what is seen as delivery out with the priority areas, so STEM engagement in primary schools. So you might see that might not be a key area that primary school teachers have a strength in, and the colleges have developed programmes to go out and work across the primary schools to get in early, P5, P6, P7, so they're starting to make their decisions about what they're thinking to do in the future when they go to high school. So you get in early, you can support the teachers, you can deliver a STEM programme. That can be related to likes of Project Willow, can be thinking about clean energy, can be thinking about low carbon, biotech. We can start putting that in place. Then as we transition, the work we can do with the secondary schools to develop their curriculum in partnership with the college creates a pathway.
Excellent, thank you for that.
Just from my point of view, I think I noticed in an earlier evidence session about the offer being made to get out to the colleges, and you're more than welcome to come to the North East to see what we're doing there. But I think that there are some things about getting the messaging right to young people, that there are going to be careers in energy transition, and I think that's going to be particularly impactful for their influences in and beyond the home. And I would say that just making sure that what we continue to do is have a dialogue from UK and Scottish Government to ensure that we are earmarking where we can the right kind of funding to go to the right kind of place for those careers to be sustainable.
For me, the colleges are really well placed to deliver on this with the right resource. I mean, in the Scottish Government STEM strategy, the colleges were given that the role to be the STEM leads and set up the regional STEM partnerships. They are in existence. They have the relevant partners all working together. And it's just then how do we use them to drive these messages home. there are a number of interventions that are in place. There's some online programmes. There's Education Scotland have a sustainability aspect to the curriculum now being implemented. We are just in the process of launching a Future and Win programme that could be targeted at schools, colleges and universities. But that's kind of limited to wind. There's a much broader opportunity here, and I think that's a bit we need to kind of convey.
Young people care about their future, and they care about being able to work within industries that are sustainable. But obviously, the influencers who are pushing them, the schools and the parents, those who have access at early years to influence the thinking, you have to push people towards sustainable jobs, current jobs that give a standard of living. I know that's where influencers will push them, and that's what was made by Stephen. The point is that we're not there yet with a lot of these sustainable industries. They're coming, but they're not there yet, and it's a timing.
That's great. I just want every young person to have an opportunity, so thanks very much for that.
Just on that point, and it's a really important point for us all, is that there are real opportunities to make sure that this, and whatever it is we do around an energy transition, is inclusive. And I think that there are many people that may not have entered into a traditional energy career beforehand who could be afforded the opportunity to do so now as we move into a greener, cleaner world. And I think going back to a point I was making earlier about how UK and Scottish Government talking together about funding is really important. We have benefited from those conversations in, for example, the Just Transition Fund, and also in terms of the investment zone monies, of which there's been, £160 million allocated to the North East for the next 10 years. So it can work.
That's great. I hope that the skill gaps that you don't know about, and how that's going to be happen soon, so that we can give all opportunity to everybody, no matter what age they are. But specifically when you speak about the young people, I think it's great opportunities for them coming.
I agree.
Now moving on to Susan Murray.
All right. This is. I'm just wondering what part of it. Sorry, I think I've just got myself out of order for the question. So just to absolutely check that I'm in the right place.
Question 8.
Right, no, that's okay. Yeah. Apologies for that. I was just paying too much attention. So, to what extent do you think that the high carbon employers have a responsibility towards training a workforce transition?
I think a lot of the larger companies get this, and they're doing a lot of work. Shell is one example. The Girls into Energy campaign, they're supporting the Energy Skills Transition Leaders programme. They get it, but I think they could do more probably. But what do they do? Because the skills challenge is mixed and varied, and it changes depending on the project life, where you are in the project life cycle. A developer requires absolutely different skill set to those who are constructing a wind farm, to those who are operating and maintaining a wind farm. So it's understanding that project life cycle. And so this is where all the timelines and the timeframes for the job roles kick in and are important. And this overlap of projects, whether it be wind or transmission, distribution or oil and gas, that's where this is really important to understand, so we can understand the job roles. But for any individual employer or company to kind of grasp that, I think is quite challenging. But they are engaged with Renewable UK, the Offshore Wind Industry Council, so BP, Shell, all these companies are engaged. And they're transitioning themselves, although they may be pulling back from that a bit at the moment, but they are looking at that whole energy transition for themselves. So they will be doing it. Neil, you've probably got a better understanding, your locale. So,
for me, I think, I would agree with Jim. I think high carbon employers do get it. We've had decades of a successful relationship with Shell that's delivered some interesting things for future careers in energy. So I'm content with them certainly being on board, and we know that others are too, and we've engaged very successfully with ECITB in terms of a contribution to our skills centre that's going to be developed and ready to run in August, September this year. And but what I would say is that is done very much in partnership with the ETZ Limited, Shell and others, including ECITB. What would be helpful, I think, is if more of those, those industries or those organisations, those businesses, were to consider about what it is that is going to be needed in terms of future skills delivery and what contribution they could make. I think there is a bit of, without seeking to repeat what's going on earlier in this conversation, there is some clarity around the apprenticeship levy and how that should be spent north of the border, and what it should deliver. And I think that would help probably the piece in terms of industry generally. And again, thinking about, we have a benefactor in the northeast of Scotland who has got no real skin in the game in relation to energy transition per se, but has funded a future skills workshop and a future skills lab within our Fraserburgh campus to the tune of about, over the last 2.5-3 years, to the tune of £900,000. Those kind of contributions make a significant impact on what it is that we do, because we've talked a lot about the kind of revenue funding that comes to colleges, but we haven't talked a great deal about capital. And that's the other thing, because this kind of transition needs kit. It needs really good buildings, and some of the estate that we operate in is not as good as it could be, and some of the kit that we've got needs to be more sector leading, more innovative, more engaging, particularly for young people who want to join us on that kind of energy transition journey.
You talked a little bit previously about the speed that things are happening at, and do you think that it is helpful when the government is seen to draw back from net zero targets, or does that encourage existing high carbon energy to look at diversification, which would encourage more collaboration across the industries, as people are just, there's more of a focus on the wider range of activities that a business could do?
I think the pullback on the targets and ambitions absolutely impacts, whether it be companies or the potential future employees. Mixed messaging is never good. Industry need confidence. Industries, our youngsters and people need to really see that they want to see a career in the sector. So I think that's a real challenge. I think the speed of things is a big challenge for us. I mean, we had, I mentioned, £3 million announced in January. We still haven't got that approved yet. And so we need to kind of strip out a lot of the bureaucracy. We need to take a bit of a risk. If we want to maximise opportunities, we need to identify this strategic pot of funding, and we need to target it to the right things, and we need to make it as simple as possible to actually make things happen. That would be my biggest plea. And have a flexible pot that can support new entrants, that could support people in industry to upskill, reskill, maximise that retention of people already in the industry and industries, and support the cross-skilling as well. So yeah, it's quite a challenge we have ahead of us.
So is there more government could do to support smaller companies? I mean, you would think, and do you think some of these smaller companies are in supply chains that are not able necessarily to retrain the workforce in a way that they would like to?
I mean, I definitely think we've touched upon this already about looking at a national skills transition training fund, and we've had these in the past, and they're a finite pot of money, or decisions are made that there's other more pressing priorities and the money gets taken away. And I think that's the challenge for the college sector, is that these pots of money come into existence, we put mechanisms in place, and then the money is either finite or it gets removed and put elsewhere. And that makes it very difficult, and then it's conflicting messaging as the targets have been drawn back. Now, obviously we live in the real world and we understand why these decisions can be made, but it does send out mixed messages, and I think if you're asking more, it's about greater engagement, I think, and engaging with sector skills groupings, so that companies can come together and understand those high carbon current companies. Will want to have a future. They will want to be in existence. They will want to be able to deliver a productivity. They will need a skilled workforce to do so. So it's incumbent upon them to engage. It's ensuring that the college sector is fit for purpose to have that engagement, so that we can support the gaps, the timings, and we're ready to deliver the skills that are needed.
And the multi-year funding is really important, because we start with SMEs and micro businesses, and it does not give them that confidence, and it doesn't allow the colleges to plan properly either. So that would be a big plea.
There's been a lot of talk about about more employer contribution into the training, and I think that has to be handled carefully, because when we're talking about apprentices, employers and industries are already employing. So they're already making the financial commitment because they're employing the young person. So they've made a commitment, and they're not necessarily getting a return right away, because you're looking at 3 to 4 years of an engagement through an apprenticeship. So there is a commitment that already employers are laying out, and they're paying the levy. So there's quite a contribution going on there, especially through modern apprenticeships. So we have to take that in consideration when we're engaging about what's the right level of contribution.
Can I maybe make one point? I think that we've learnt a lot through the Flexible Workforce Development Fund disappearing, because it allowed us to engage with a lot more employers than we previously would have. But once that fund had disappeared, the employers themselves weren't prepared to pay, because they didn't necessarily see that as a priority. And what we need to kind of make sure that we do understand is that whatever funding comes to the colleges is there to deliver to their need. And I think that, and you'll probably hear from Doug in the second panel session here, but recently in the Scottish Parliament's Economy and Fair Work Committee, Doug from Aurora Energy mentioned the Fraserburgh campus of our college, and the fact that he had asked, I think, for 8 apprenticeship offers or places and could only get 2. We are capped. The reality is that there is demand, and whilst we would love to be able to deliver all that, for example, Aurora Energy would want, the reality is that we're trying to be fair and equitable to other employers too. There is demand, and I think the model needs to be rethought, and I am grateful that SFC and Scottish Government are trying to do this, but it does feel a little bit slow, it does feel still unfair, and the funding model that comes to allow us to deliver to what employers need really needs to be proportionate and at pace.
Okay. This question's specifically to you, Mr MacInnes. Could you give us an idea of how aligned refinery workers' skills are to the current labour market in the local area?
So within the Grangemouth cluster and the chemical manufacturing, there will be an alignment, absolutely. I think what we are seeing in terms of the employees that have gauged through the training needs analysis is that people are looking just to bolster certain skills that they think would give them an advantage within the workplace. And what we're seeing coming through is the majority of employees are asking for NEBOSH, so health and safety training, IBOSH, BOSET, so basic offshore safety training, offshore medicals. So they obviously feel confident that they've got the broader skill sets. They're just looking to say, well, maybe this is lapsed complex training, which is looking at working in explosive hazardous areas. So yes, I think there are transferable skills. I just think that for a lot of people who have been in these industries for a long time, this decision has now happened, and a lot of people are obviously very concerned and worried, and they're now looking to say, well, where can I move to? But I think they have a very highly trained, skilled, and a very a workforce that can move into different industries, and we are seeing some people actually making moves into different industries.
I noticed, I think it was the recycling company you referred to earlier, Celtic, it may not have been, who want to move on to the Grangemouth site, and they seemed very anxious to move on to the Grangemouth site very quickly, because they felt that if they didn't get on there this year, a lot of the people with the skills that they need would have gone into other industries, which is
Celtic
one of the
Renewables,
reasons for asking.
Celtic Renewables are already there.
Yeah.
They are already producing,
yeah.
And their production is now flowing. They're looking to expand. Yeah. But in conversation with companies from Grangemouth, what I'm being told is that there is land available, there is the effluent supply support system there is energy. What's not is skills. And what they would want is the college to be at the table and part of the discussion to see a full package of support for future investment. So if you have the college in partnership with the right universities, that then shows to a future investor who's looking to come in, actually, Grangemouth is offering the full package. You've got the land, you've got the infrastructure, you've got the support, but you've got the skills pipeline as well. And I do think, again, it comes back to this point, I can't stress it enough, it's about timing. There are a number of companies that are coming in, but there's a lot of current interest and ground hasn't been broken. But what will happen is if we don't start the skills now that are related to what's needed in terms of delivering, there will be a gap. Companies will be in the construction, they'll be breaking ground, they'll be building, and then we'll have a gap for skills, and that will stop people investing. So if you have the college at the table, it shows that we've actually got this together. We're a one-stop shop, and we can actually demonstrate to future investors that we've got this sorted, and they can see that they've got the pipeline flow of skills as well.
Yeah. And do you think there are lessons for government management of industrial transition that can be learned from Grangemouth?
Absolutely.
I'm not surprised you answered in that way.
Absolutely.
I was expecting that. Yeah,
absolutely.
Would you like to maybe suggest 2 or 3 that you think are top priority?
I think, again, you know, we've known about Project Willow and everything that's within that for 4 or 5 years. It's been worked on for quite a length of time. I think the point was made by a union representative that the rubber is now hitting the road on just transition, and this is a bit of a barrier. You know, we could have been much further down the road with this, but I think we have to ensure that there is engagement, that there is a clear policy and strategy to ensure we get this right. My concern is that we will have a gap, that we won't have the skills coming through in the time needed. So we have to start now, and we have to prime it. So we have to take that investment and recognise that we need to start delivering now. Apprenticeships take 4, so there's a cross-skill and upskilling which can happen in a much more, you know, shorter time scale. But if you're looking at modern apprentices and graduate apprentices to come out with the relevant skills, that's a 4 to 5 year period. So we have to start now if we're to come out for 2030 and beyond. So I think it is about stepping back, and the lessons learned is we have probably not got timing right on this.
Well, government has known for 5 years at least that Grangemouth was going to be that Petronians were going to be departing from Grangemouth, and as you say, Project Willow could have started earlier as well and have concluded earlier and be in the process of being implemented earlier
from
too.
the employees and from the union's perspective, that is absolutely a point that's been laid to the Scottish Government and to Petronians. But again, you know, Petronians have had their own views and put forward why those decisions were taken. But I think from a government's perspective, yes, that this could have been, and it's complex, there's a whole host of reasons, but yeah, we could have been further down the line on this.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That concludes our questions to you this morning. So thank you very much again for your time. It's been very, very interesting, and I'm sure will add hugely to our inquiry and to the work that we're doing on the issue. But thank you very much. I'm going to say order, so we stop broadcasting. Just tell Good morning and welcome to our second panel. I'm going to begin the questioning this morning, and I'm going to be addressing my first question particularly to Mr Duguid and Mr Templeton. Can I ask you how you found recruitment for clean energy skills and which skill sets are most in demand in the clean energy sector? Mr Duguid, if you'd like to begin.
So, just in terms of background, I'm the CEO and the founder of Aurora Energy Services, which is headquartered in Inverness and has a base in Aberdeen, Huntly and Wick, and has a training centre in Inverness, which a number of the members of this committee have visited. So we're finding in terms of skills for the green energy, particularly around wind turbines, blade technicians is a difficult role to fill. Also some significant shortages in electrical personnel. One of the previous panellists mentioned senior authorised persons. There's a significant shortage of those people, and trying to recruit them is difficult, and it's a long process to get them authorised, because they not only have to have the initial skill set, but they also then have to have OEM, so they have to have the manufacturer certification, whether it be Siemens, Vestas or GE, and that takes a period of time and is very expensive. So those are two examples of skills that are in relatively short supply. I think there are other skills in the future years that are coming that are going to be more significant, but those are two that are very current at the moment.
Thank you. And Mr Templeton, if you'd introduce yourself, and then I'd ask you the same question. I can repeat it if you've forgotten.
That's fine. Thanks very much, Chair. Good morning, everyone. My name is Gavin Templeton. I'm the Chief Executive of Veri Energy. Veri Energy are an infrastructure development company focused on repurposing existing industrial assets. Our first activities are working with the owners of Sullom Terminal, which was formerly the largest oil terminal in Europe in the Shetland Islands. And we're developing projects on carbon storage, e-fuels and renewable energy there. So I think from our perspective, particularly looking at the projects we're developing, maybe we'll start with carbon storage. The jobs that we need are oil and gas jobs. It's exactly the same skills that we need in order to develop these new sorts of opportunities. Actually not dissimilar on e-fuels, which is the combination of green hydrogen and biogenic CO2 to produce fuel. The process engineering jobs are again oil and gas jobs. So I think from our perspective there are a plethora of different jobs out there, certainly the people who want to move into the sector. Actually we are wholly owned by Enquest, which is a mid-cap oil and gas company listed in the London Stock Exchange. And working actively with Enquest and bringing those personnel over, but we have got a bit of a challenge. Firstly, that we're in development. In terms of those sorts of projects, they take 4 or 5 years to they reach generating revenue, particularly carbon storage and e-fuels. So that's on one hand. Actually providing finances for that is quite challenging. On the other hand, obviously there's significant pressure on oil and gas. The fiscal environment and the energy profits levy mean that investment, particularly for some of these mid-cap companies, is actually quite difficult because free cash flow is very difficult to come by, and you need to have that free cash flow to invest in those future opportunities. And as I mentioned, they take time to develop.
And again, to both of you, would there be a way of better incentivising employers to invest in developing those skills?
Well, I think the point was made at the last committee that the employers are already contributing significantly. If you look at apprenticeships, if you take our own case, we have a whole number of apprentices, both modern, foundation and graduate apprentices. So, that requires the business to be profitable and to be able to fund those things. I'm not sure that there's a huge amount more that employers can do in the traditional apprenticeships and that course into industry. What I would argue is that there are more incremental ways of increasing skills and adult retraining that potentially employers can do more of. So I mentioned earlier the shortage in blade repair technicians elsewhere in the world where we operate. In the US as an example, we do a lot of adult retraining into that because it lends itself to increasing the level of skill over a period of time. And the individuals can work and gain experience whilst doing training in modules effectively. So there's some of that I think that employers here could do. But it is difficult to justify more apprenticeships. I think the colleges work very well with employers currently. That relationship works well. We work with NESCOL and UHI, and there's possibly more that we can do in terms of that more modular approach to training. And I think there's also some areas where the colleges potentially could utilise private skilled providers to supplement what they do. And that does happen in some cases, but I think there's probably more of that could be done also.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, there's definitely desire and appetite, but the current environment is making it quite challenging. I heard from the previous panel, talking about the Goldilocks zone, I think it was, where it's just right. And I think that's a huge challenge for the transition today, given the current fiscal environment. I mean, I think there's nuances as well in terms of some of the decarbonisation reliefs that exist around the energy profits levy, which are very narrowly defined, and actually quite difficult to achieve for companies that are wanting to invest in these opportunities. It's actually quite challenging to do so. So I think thinking about the transition and thinking about ways in which we can retain those jobs whilst we build up the new energy opportunities and the transition opportunities so they become economic. The sooner that we can do that and accelerate those opportunities, the better that we can retain those skills, which we are seeing leaving as of today.
Thank you. I'm going to change our order of asking questions slightly because my colleague Kirstine Sullivan has to leave to get to the chamber to ask a question. So Kirstine, could we have your question next, please?
Absolutely. So we've already heard from the previous panel about their thoughts on the energy skills passport. So I would just like to ask you your views on how effective the energy skills passport is, and what role does industry have to play in making that passport a success?
Hi, I'm Lynsey Benson. I'm the Head of Policy and External Affairs for the ECITB. We are an employer-led, arm's-length body of the UK government supporting the engineering construction industry. The engineering construction industry spans over 8 different sectors, so it's oil and gas, nuclear, renewables, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, power generation, water treatment and food and drink processing, ensuring that the workforce has the mission-critical skills involved throughout the project life cycle from design through to decommissioning in the UK's critical infrastructure. All these industries combined contribute over 100 billion gross value added to the UK economy each year. And that engineering construction industry is absolutely vital for the country to meet its net zero goals. In terms of your question around the Energy Skills Passport, we welcome the Energy Skills Passport and certainly the collaboration that we UK and our UK have demonstrated in launching that earlier this year. It is a tool, and it's a tool for workers that they can help recognise how they can move across different sectors and the skills that they already have. But fundamentally, the bigger focus has to be that we ensure that we continue to build a standardised skills system, which is an open, agile and responsive system. I think we heard from the colleges this morning, so that those skills are there for when the nascent industries come online, that we're actually reducing the barriers as opposed to having digital tools to try and overcome them.
Thank you.
I mean, I think the skills passport is in its infancy. I would say we haven't seen much benefit from it as yet. I think it's a good piece of work and it's a good foundation stone for people to demonstrate that they have the skills to transition across. But it hasn't had much impact yet practically. I think there are other barriers which are more significant, some of which have been touched on already, around the availability of roles at the current juncture as opposed to what's coming, I think is a much more significant barrier to people moving across. And it was touched on earlier also, the differences in remuneration, those are also significant. I mean, our own business, we have a significant oil and gas business and a significant wind business, and we're paying different deals in those two different industries. And so if you take a mechanical technician in the oil and gas sector, he would be, to take a comparable job in wind, would be looking at a £10,000 to £15,000 a year reduction in salary, which is very significant for an individual, obviously. And that, I think, will balance out over time, but that difference exists currently, and that's more of a barrier to people moving across. And the existence of solid long-term jobs in wind and renewables is it's coming, but it's not there yet. So there's a real timing issue around the transition, and there are far too many optimistic predictions being made about people transferring from oil and gas across to renewables when those jobs are not in place yet. They're coming, and ironically, there's going to be a significant skill shortage when they do come by 2028, 2030. But right now, those jobs don't exist, and that's a real, there was a lot of discussion earlier about the EPL and the impact that it's having. So what the current fiscal regime, as far as I can see, is creating a bit of a cliff edge, and people are being made redundant as a consequence of that. And there are not renewable jobs, long-term renewable jobs for them currently, and that means that they're leaving to go overseas.
But would you agree, following on from earlier comments, that actually it's really important to act before something happens? So you're saying that the jobs aren't there yet. Isn't this a vital step to ensure that the skills are there to provide the workforce once the jobs come online?
I think the skills are there. It is the same skills. So these are common skills so a mechanical technician, a pipe fitter, an electrical technician, that they deploy in oil and gas. It's exactly the same skills in a different occupational setting. The skills are there. There is, our employers are certainly telling us there's so much uncertainty in the industry just now that is preventing them making commitments to bring on more people into the industry. So we need to tackle the project uncertainty, the delays in some of the planning consents, the decisions, financial investment decisions on projects that are being delayed due to policy uncertainty. And that slowdown in oil and gas, which feels like it's being accelerated, are all contributing to the lack of confidence and the employers not making those commitments to skills. These are the same skills. We need to make sure that we standardise those skills so that we're recognising maybe some of just the bolt-on elements that the current workforce need to move when they're working across different projects. And it doesn't necessarily need a move away from oil and gas into a low-carbon project. We've just launched a pilot programme just now this week in Grangemouth. It's a two-way transition project for oil and gas workers to cross-skill into wind, so that we're recognising their primary occupations so they can be deployed back into oil and gas, but they can also be deployed onto wind projects as well. That's enabling employers, especially the supply chain, make more opportunities in diversifying their business areas, but we're creating an integrated workforce, which is not about just deploying somebody on an oil and gas platform or deploying them on a wind farm, that they can actually do both at the same time.
So are you confident that the UK's Office for Clean Energy jobs will have a really important role to play in improving workforce planning in Scotland?
Absolutely. I think that's what we need, is a strong ethos on informed workforce planning and very much a collaborative approach to those skills commitments and pledges, particularly in the tendering process. So that workforce planning needs to start with the project developers and taking accountability for skills across the project development, across the project life cycle, and create a collaboration with supply chain partners to then instill those skills commitments through the project and through the various phases of the project. I think Office for Clean Energy jobs are collaborating very well to determine that regional data and to support targeted planning and delivery for skills in certain regions where they will be needed.
If I can just follow on from that targeted approach, your organisation has called for a cross-departmental government task force to monitor and address workforce bottlenecks. What problems do you think that would solve? So I think we've learned about oil and gas and wind and so on today, and when I mentioned in my opening statement about the engineering construction industry, all the skills that we're mentioning today, these are common skills across these industries. We've got a massive nuclear new build programme based in England, and we also have decommissioning nuclear in Scotland as well. These are common skills. We need to look at the workforce planning as a whole and the competition for skills across these different industries. We can't prioritise one industry to the decline of another and kind of poach workforce from one sector at the disadvantage of another. So it needs to remove these bottlenecks. I think the main bottlenecks as well is very much around project uncertainty. We need to give employers commitments to be able to take on, or confidence to be able to take on new entrants into industry. One of the ways in which we are trying to help with that, so we heard a lot about apprenticeships today. There's many different routes into industry than just apprenticeships. We're rolling out scholarships in industry just now. That's a 2-year scholarship where we are providing education through the college network and qualifications, and we're filling the pipeline of new entrants coming into the industry without necessarily commitments where supply chain haven't yet received contract awards to be able to commit to that. So we're trying to backfill that pipeline so that when employers can make commitments, that the pipeline's there, that those workers can accelerate through an apprenticeship much quicker, and they're much more productive from day one with the employers as well. That's one way that we're doing that. We're also doing some work-ready programmes where we're taking people that have not been in employment or education through a 16-week programme and giving bursaries, as we do with the scholarships. We provide bursaries for those learners in that education. And we're giving them the key skills so that they can work as trainees in employers, so that they're giving, it's helping support more diversity and inclusion in the industry, and it's helping a different skill set coming into the industry as well. Thank you.
Ms. Murray.
Thank you very much. We have heard in your answers just now that the paying conditions are often a barrier to people moving, and that further education and industry are working to try and overcome these barriers. But there is also, we're hearing that people are relocating abroad. So it's not relocation abroad itself that is the problem. What do you think the problems are in getting people to relocate within the UK when there are opportunities?
I think that some of the relocation abroad happening right now is happening because of the pressure on the oil and gas industry. We are experiencing people leaving the industry to go and find oil and gas jobs overseas, as opposed to staying here and looking at the transition opportunities here. Talking about my specific experience on carbon storage, these are exactly the jobs I need. It's exactly the experience I need. Subsurface engineers, wells engineers, that we're kind of at the design stage, if you like, so it's actually reasonably early in the development. I mentioned, commerciality probably in 2030. I'm really worried there's going to be a transition. A just transition will happen, but it will happen somewhere else, and it won't happen here because we'll have lost all those jobs and that experience. And I think the way that the government can help on that is by accelerating opportunities in the transition. We are focused on developing a merchant model of carbon storage, which is not 100% relying on the government. It's really working with the government in a public-private partnership. And I think there's opportunities to bring the private sector to the table to help that acceleration as well, because we need to be very constructive, recognising the government, finances are under pressure as well. But I think you will find an industry which is up for that conversation and trying to find solutions to move these things forward so we don't lose that expertise, because the appetite is there, the workforce is keen to move. We've got passionate people in Aberdeen, passionate people in the Shetlands at Sullenvoe Terminal that really want to pursue these new opportunities, but they take time, as I mentioned, and because of the pressure on the oil and gas industry, which, you know, where these skills are coming from, you know, that expertise, the risk is it leaves, and we don't get that opportunity here.
It's fundamentally more about timing. I mean, if some of these projects were a little further advanced, if you look at Scotland, you know, there is an enormous number of jobs going to be created in the Highlands and along the Cromarty Firth, in the tens of thousands, but they're not there yet, and people are leaving to work overseas. It would fill some of those roles. There's also going to be a significant shortage of construction skills, I would argue. So welding, plate and pipe fit and those types of skills are going to be in serious acute shortage by 2028 if you look at the predictions for hull assembly, turbine assembly in the north of Scotland. So I think to the point that Kirstine made earlier, yes, there is a need to start that training and transition now and to be producing more of those skilled people. It's about how is that funded and is there certainty around the project timing, because every project developer that I've talked to, and Aurora works closely with MacInnes, who are the operators of the yard, the Sear yard, and we've talked to the developers and to incoming investors from overseas, so HHI, Min-Yang. The issue for those investors is timing, certainty of timing, and the consenting and permitting and planning has improved, and the collaboration between the two governments, I would argue, is much better of late, and that's to be applauded. But there's still more to be done in creating certainty around those projects, because that will bring the inward investment and will allow employers to commit to taking on people to fill those roles. I mean, it is literally about those things overlapping in the right way to allow that to happen. It's not that the skills don't. Some of those skills already exist, particularly for operations and maintenance. The oil and gas guys that do that for carbon capture and storage, for hydrogen, even for turbines on wind farms, the right skills are there. It's just that those jobs don't exist in sufficient number currently. The other thing that I think is often missed is that the wind industry particularly is very seasonal. So blade repair, overhaul work, painting offshore only takes place in the summer. As a WAG said to me recently, they build these things where it's windy, so it's quite difficult to get a consistent work programme. And that means that if you're trying to, in a practical sense, if you're trying to get somebody to come from oil and gas who's doing a 2 and 3 rota, a 3 and 3 rota, and you say to them, well, I can give you a summer's work doing this, but it's slightly less well paid, it's not really an attractive proposition. So some of it is structural to how the wind industry works as well, because the developers have given long-term contracts to the OEMs, not to independent service providers like ourselves. So it's fundamentally different from oil and gas. And those OEMs tend to bring their workers, in many cases from overseas, because they're allowed to, because they have specific skills. But also, to get somebody qualified to work on their equipment, you're required to do their courses, which can be up to £60,000 per individual. So it is a barrier to people moving across. And some of those things are very granular, but they're very real in terms of the transition. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of very optimistic talk about how easy this is going to be. And, some of those real practical issues are being missed.
And we're seeing that with the cross-skilling programme that we're doing just now. So we've engaged with oil and gas contractors. They have the skills, they have the workforce to cross-skill them into wind. But for them to identify opportunities to deploy those workers into wind is quite difficult because, as Doug said, the original equipment manufacturers of the turbines generally install those infrastructures with warranties of 5 years plus. So it's very difficult for supply chain to enter into what could be a monopoly market as well. There is opportunities, there absolutely is, especially when the warranties, there's opportunities when these turbines come out of warranties, and not all of them are installed with warranties from overseas as well. But it's certainly a barrier for the current large contracting workforce just now to cross-skill when there isn't significant opportunities to deploy those workers afterwards as well.
One point that I would make, it sounds, some of my points have sound negative, and that's not how I feel about this. This is a fantastic opportunity. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity with this transition. The problem is the timing and the practicalities around that. There's a huge opportunity to create a long-term skilled workforce, particularly in the Highlands and Islands, that can have good skilled jobs ongoing for many decades ahead. Very different from what happened in oil and gas during the construction phase at Ardeshir and Neg. I'm old enough to remember those days where we went from 5,000 people to 300, and then back up again. This is an opportunity to build a workforce long-term around the kind of things that Gavin was talking about, as well as the wind industry. But it's about having the right support mechanisms in place so that timing can actually work to allow that to happen.
So that's all really optimistic and everything, but what I'm hearing, does that make the workforce planning even more important? Because it's the numbers of jobs that are going to be transitioned across. It is the number of scholarships, which I presume are also limited by the caps on the colleges at the moment.
No,
not at all.
It's an ECITB intervention, so we're providing the bursaries, so we're supporting those people through those scholarships and providing the funding for the colleges to do it.
So is any, you're clearly concentrating on the jobs and the skills, but to move that skilled workforce into the north of Scotland, we are going to need homes and infrastructure for these people. And at the moment, that what's your impression of whether or not that will be available? If we can get the jobs and skills right, the training right, are we going to be able to move people into the areas?
Well, I think there's a lot of effort going into that, and there are things that are very positive. If you look at SSEN is building 1,000 houses in relation to the network upgrades, which is another significant demand workforce-wise. And I think the Scottish Government and the Highland Council, particularly in that area, are working towards trying to create both private housing and some publicly funded housing. So there are things that are happening. Is it happening quickly enough to address what's coming? I'm not sure, but there certainly are some positive things happening, and there are other parts of both the Scottish and UK government that are contributing to building that infrastructure, because it's not only homes, it's obviously schools. The power system, ironically, in the Highlands in terms of creating new villages and towns is an issue also. So there are positive things happening. I think, again, could it be accelerated by, I know that government funding is very stretched, but are there kind of private-public partnerships that might accelerate that? I think probably there are.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think we work quite closely with the Shetland Island Council, and they're obviously concerned about this, and I think they would quite like that headache if there was a bit of pressure because we're bringing more jobs to the Shetland Islands. I don't see that in Aberdeen at the moment. I think it's actually the opposite. We're seeing jobs leaving en masse. So I think in terms of that, it's probably specifically in other areas, but I think talking to the Shetland Island Council, I'm sure they'd welcome a bit of problem in that regard in terms of how do we bring more jobs to the Shetland Islands.
And this is already here. We're consulting on our next 5-year strategy just now, and I've been around the country, and certainly in our Scotland region, we're hearing from our nuclear employers up in the area as well that actually their barriers to training and skills is a lot down to housing. They don't have the necessary housing to be able to attract the people that they need into the plant as well. So definitely much more a focus on place-based skills development and promoting local content development within those regions as well.
And in that sense, do we need to have more training for joiners and plumbers and electricians at domestic construction level as well?
Yeah. I mean, the irony is that things like the network upgrade are drawing people from those trades, from the water industry, from elsewhere, because there are higher wages being paid in the network upgrade. So the irony is that some of those skills are actually being drawn out of what's needed for housing construction. And so, yes, there needs to be more investment in bringing people into that. I think also there fundamentally needs to be an understanding that we're still going to need foreign workforce as well. Yep. You know, if you look at the numbers, it simply is not practical for the construction element of offshore floating wind to think that we're going to produce all of that with UK workers. It's just not going to happen. So there needs to be a hybrid, and it needs to be a long-term plan so that as over an 8 to 10 year period we're moving towards an indigenous workforce for the O&M piece. But during construction we're going to need foreign workforce to some degree.
Which calls into that workforce planning at a national level as well as down to a regional level as well. So just what you've mentioned there, it's all about collaboration. ECITB have signed an MOU with CITB and EDF with Sizewell C already. So we're starting to think about skills, and Suffolk County Council much into the future, and the construction and the engineering construction skills that will be needed for that as well. So it definitely needs a much more joined up collaborative approach from government, from industry bodies and from employers and project developers.
So just finally, to move away just slightly from that, and I think to an extent, you know, you've answered this a little bit, but offshore wind developer Ocean Winds have told us that market signals are working against the development of clean energy projects in the north of Scotland. What are your views on that?
I'm not sure that I see that. I mean, I think there are some barriers in terms of the fiscal structure as well, you know, around how CDFs are working and how that the clean technology bonus, you know, there are some complexities there. I'm not sure of that well understood. It's difficult to say if they're delaying some of those commitments. What I do see moving is that consenting and planning and all of that is moving ahead more quickly, which is to be encouraged. But I think, you know, if you look at the wind industry in the UK in general, we have seen a couple of projects stopped. So Hornsea 3, I think, was just stopped recently. And that basically, to me, means that those developers and the investors are not seeing the returns. And that's partly, I think, because costs have increased substantially. So just the capital cost of building these facilities, whether that's steel structures, cables, turbines, they're all going up in cost. And if you look globally, the turbine manufacturers have been through a very difficult situation commercially and financially. None of them have been making money. If you look at Siemens, they were bailed out by the German government to the tune of €2 billion recently. You know, GE, Vestas, they're all having their troubles, and that means that's translated into higher prices for their equipment, and that's, you know, probably a bigger factor in delaying developments, I think.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I did a bit of work advising the First Minister in Scotland on Scotland, and I think there's been a huge amount of planning, consenting and grid connection done. I think, you know, historically that has been a huge challenge in taking years to get things connected to the grid. You know, and the old adage, time kills deals, so people just give up and go somewhere else to do investment. I think there's a huge amount of work underway to improve that. I think the transmission charges are obviously a big challenge in terms of the connection from the very north of Scotland to some of the more populated areas. But I think there's obviously another programme of work in terms of, you know, redesigning the grid, if you like, in terms of how all that is happening. So I think a lot of that will hopefully wash out and improve those sorts of opportunities. You know, so in terms of that feedback from Ocean Winds, you might, you know, see some remedies on the horizon for that.
Mr. Maureen Burke.
I think the previous question has touched a bit on what my question was going to be about, you know, the shortage of clean energy and the skills if it's hindering the project. But what could the government do to ensure that clean energy jobs supply chains scale up at the pace needed to match the decline of oil and gas?
Well, I think they could slow the decline of oil and gas, would be the simplest method. So extending the EPL and making it more onerous has accelerated the reduction of the jobs go in oil and gas. So one of the simplest methods would be to give some relief against that, because that would slow the decline in jobs that there are in the North Sea oil and gas industry. I think in terms of creating an environment for more jobs in the clean energy sector, I think quite a lot of that is being done already. It's not, I don't feel that that's a barrier to increasing employment. Those jobs are going to come when those developments become a reality. So I don't know that there's much stimulus required to do that. But in terms of the actual transition, the simplest way, in my view, would be to slow the decline of the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I would also add that there's a big role for the likes of GB Energy, National Wealth Fund, Scottish National Investment Bank here in terms of the public finances, because there is a policy solution here, but there's these big institutions that should be leaning in to accelerate the transition, accelerate the opportunity, and putting that capital to work to bring those opportunities forward. In a former life, I was part of the Green Investment Bank, part of the team that set that up, which again was set up by the coalition government, and really that was focused on accelerating offshore wind by combining capital with the policy, if you like, in terms of bringing that investment through. So I think there is a big opportunity. With the creation of the GB Energy, we actually had all three institutions up at SVT, Sullenbow, talking about what we're doing, and lots of enthusiasm there, but we keen for them to be leaning in. So as well as having that, we need to think about how we manage the decline in oil and gas, because it is a decline, but we need to manage it properly and bring forward those opportunities in those new energies. Floating offshore wind is a massive opportunity for the UK and Scotland, particularly the supply chain. We are pioneers in that. Similarly, carbon storage, we're pioneering in that. So, big opportunity to create the jobs, to create the supply chain by not only harnessing the policy of the UK government, but also mobilising the capital from those big institutions which are focused in this area.
And I think it's worth saying that they are doing that. And if you look at what SNIB and the UK Wealth Fund have done, particularly in relation to ports, they've from Aurora's perspective, SNIB has provided us with a debt package which has allowed us to accelerate our growth. We've had support from HIE in terms of the training centre in Inverness. So there are things happening, that are positive around that. And the government's funding of CCUS for Teesside and for the northwest of England. Love to see Acorn be part of that as well. But those are things that are really stimulating real job growth. So there are positive things happening. And again, there's good collaboration between the UK and the Scottish Government around those things, because I think the strategic importance of them is realised by both governments, and that's to be applauded. I've seen a lot more collaboration over the last year or so than we have for a very long time.
Just on the collaboration piece as well, and I'd just like to highlight the kind of contractual conditions that some of the supply chain particularly are up against with kind of low carbon projects. I mean, certainly maybe a role for GB Energy is to look at influencing a shift change in those contractual conditions, where we're moving away from fixed price lump sum contracting towards a more collaborative approach towards delivering successful project outcomes as opposed to individual work scopes. Where supply chain have a well-defined work scope in confident conditions, there's certainly places for lump sum fixed price contracting. But where supply chain are deploying new technology that's not really been deployed at scale as much, and doing projects that have never been quite done before, that certainly lends itself to a better kind of risk equity across the project, and support better risk reward, as opposed to pushing risk down the supply chain, which may not be best placed to manage that overall risk. So I think having a look at shift change and contractual conditions, particularly around offshore wind, hydrogen, CCUS by its very nature is collaborative. You need all supply chain partners to build out the value chain. All those supply chain partners should have a vested interest in the successful project outcomes as opposed to their individual self-work scopes across those projects. And arguably, the clean energy industry could learn from oil and gas in that regard, because things like Pilot back a decade ago, the oil companies and the supply chain working together more collaboratively and balancing where the risk rests was very positive for the oil and gas industry and for the supply chain. And at the moment, the conditions in the wind industry, the weight of risk with the supply chain and with the contractors is totally out of proportion to the reward. And that's training as well. So we're not talking about just technical training. There's management leadership, but there's commercial training and commercial awareness. And we need to remove some of those cultural barriers that could potentially move over into new energies, which we don't want to see, that could impede successful project outcomes.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Just a couple of questions to finish up, because we are running quickly out of time. Are there lessons that we could learn from other countries about effective workforce transition?
Yes, I think there are, actually. It was interesting when we were talking about the difference in remuneration for the workforce. So we have a significant business in Australia, and essentially there's no difference. And so we have a big wind farm construction business in Australia, and there's very little difference in terms of the wage rates between that and oil and gas, because we have some presence in oil and gas there as well. And what's interesting about that is that Australia is a very unionised environment, and the unions have had a positive impact in ensuring that kind of parity is in place. And it also around safety and health, and there's just a more uniform structure to the wind industry than exists here currently, I would say. And in the US, you've got a lot more workforce. They're a lot more transient in nature, but they're also, the US, because there's less reliance on the OEMs and there's a much higher presence of independent service providers, it gives greater certainty to the workforce, because they're not tied to working for somebody who's got a warranty period or whatever. They're actually able to move them between different. And obviously in the US, you've got an onshore wind industry with 90,000 turbines over 1 megawatt. So there's a big market to play in, but they have, because of the structure of the industry, there's a better certainty of employment for the people who are working, particularly for the service providers.
Surely in the Australian example that you gave, that could be replicated if there was willingness amongst employers to pay the same wages. It doesn't need the trade unions to make the pressure.
It doesn't, but I think the reality, I just look at the Australian experience. If you look further back, there was a differential, and the unions were not involved, and they've become involved, and it's given it a more uniform structure. I'm not saying that it needs to be a union to stimulate that here, but I also think it's a supply and demand thing, because the wind industry has got the people that it needs currently, and it's only the short-term stuff that they need seasonally that they're having to pay more for. But I think as the number of wind farms and the number of other green energy facilities increase, those things will come back in balance.
Mention that to my colleagues in the trade union movement and get them more involved in the offshore wind industry.
Yeah, I think the UK is pioneering in a lot of ways, right? We are acting first in a lot of these technologies.
Indeed.
But I think there's probably a lot to be learned from what not to do in terms of managed decline of one industry we're transitioning to another industry. So there's maybe more examples of what not to do that we can learn from. Again, I was working in a previous role in the Just Energy Transition Partnerships and coal transition in South Africa, Indonesia and Vietnam. Huge intractable problems. And I remember engaging with some South African colleagues who were looking at what happened in the 80s in the UK in the coal industry as an example of what not to do. So I think that's a risk that we have here. So that's something to bear in mind.
We're doing some work on that too. So
okay.
Thank you for that.
Neil made a really good point in the last session on Norway and how Norway are managing a just transition and the workers feel that they've got confidence. I would just make the point that Norway is just an extra 30 minutes on a helicopter away.
Like, we visited Norway, and that wasn't certainly what I picked up, because my understanding was that Norway's always had green energy because it only has hydropower and therefore electricity. So it's not so much it's transitioning, it's just that it's not coming out of oil and gas. Right. It's a slightly different sort of scenario altogether. But there are a lot of things I think we can learn from Norway. I think they've got a lot of this right. Our visit was very eye-opening for us. So Norway is somewhere that we do need to learn from. I mean, one of the questions, Ms. Benson, was that I had in my mind was, are skills transferable? I mean, do we have any problems in terms of Scotland and the UK having slightly different regimes in terms of training? Is there a problem about transferring skills across the border?
No, I think when you talk about qualifications, maybe site of qualifications, we've been doing some work within that. One of the initiatives that our employers led, particularly in the upstream industry, was called Connected Competence, and it standardised a base level of technical competence for your key kind of site-based construction trades. Now, over 20 upstream operators have signed up to a charter to help instill more of or influence more adoption to that base standard across the supply chain partners. And that really helps workers move across contractors or different contractors, but it also recognises technical competence assurance, and there's no borders that differentiate what that looks like. So that's one really good example of, at a national level, how we could recognise a base level of technical competence assurance from existing occupations that are absolutely needed as we transition. And one other point is that we need to recognise the skills of those occupations and not start calling them maybe something else because they're applying the same skills but just in a different occupational setting. I think that confuses workers and it confuses employers. So keeping the clarity and the standardisation of skills will help support mobility and transferability of skills. There is absolutely a contextual element to how they apply those skills, but that can be bolt-ons as they move across different sectors. But those core skills and the application of those core skills are exactly the same.
Can I just ask you, Mr. Templeton, a question? It was just something that you'd mentioned earlier about the danger of losing workers overseas, and I understand what you meant by that. But and I have no expertise in this area whatsoever, but I'd always had the impression, just from talking to people that worked in the sector over the years, that there was a lot of movement around the globe in terms of the oil and gas industry, that people would work 1 week or not 1 week perhaps, but maybe 1 year in Dubai and then come back and work off Norway's coast or off Scotland somewhere. Is that not something we've always done? Is it just that it's accelerated?
Yeah, I think it's more, I mean, I say it's more terminal, right? So people are leaving and not coming back because the jobs are not here. You know, and I think the interesting thing, we're engaging with national oil companies who want to learn from what we're doing at Sullenvoe. So international oil companies who are coming to say, well, actually, you're creating a template. This is a microcosm of what we're going to experience later. So, you know, the idea that the workers that exist in Scotland that are going to go overseas and then do that sort of, you know, that activity at terminals somewhere in the Far East, for example, you know, that's a real risk. You know, so that's the risk I'm alluding to. The jobs are just not coming back because it is very fluid, obviously.
Has any work been done to map that movement at all? It'd be very interesting.
I don't know, but I think you know, the headlines that we've seen, you know, from Harbour Energy, the combination of oil companies in the North Sea, so Shell and Equinor, Repsol and Neo. You know, they're combining and they're, you know, they're not. It's not 100 plus 100 equals 200. It's 100 plus 100 equals 100. Now, I don't know how those, you know, companies will evolve, but you know, those jobs are leaving, and the supply chain, the associated supply chain, will be affected by that as well. So that's kind of what I was alluding to. And
some of the supply chain jobs are leaving also. I mean, a lot of the Aberdeen-based companies, they're not doing work for the North Sea now. You know, I have friends in the industry who 90% of their work and 90% of the hardware that they produce is going somewhere else. And some of them are going to relocate if there's a continued decline in the North Sea? Why would they not be based in Singapore or Brazil or Houston? Because the terms here are just not friendly anymore.
And that was a key message that our employers were telling us. We ran some recent roundtables with DESNES on the consultation for the future of the North Sea, and that was quite clear from some employers that because of the global ramp up in oil and gas, that conditions are more favourable internationally. There are better margins, better conditions, so they're struggling in terms of kind of waiting around to wait on uncertain projects with potentially lower conditions, lower margins, and where there is obviously that global competition.
Thank you very much. That concludes our questions for this morning. Thank you for your time and thank you for your patience while we took the other panel too. But I'm now going to close the meeting. Order.